Hi, everyone. Welcome to our final CAD Lunch Forum of the semester. I can't believe how fast it's flown by. I'm Leora Visotsky, the staff managing director here. The center is also run by a faculty board of directors from across our programs. This year, our board consists of Fernando Lara, Miriam Solis, and Nerea Feliz, who are presenting today, Alex Yeshka, and Martin Hadish. CAD lunch forums are really meant to be more informal presentations and opportunities for faculty and students to share collaborations, works in progress, research that they might want to receive feedback on or allow for more discussion around, and to also show you students what practice is really like. And the dialogue format that we're having today is also really meant to show the ways in which our disciplines overlap and intersect and sometimes even contradict one another. And to allow people in disparate programs also to talk to one another. So in order to facilitate that, our presenters will dialogue today for about 45 minutes, after which we'll open up to discussion and questions before we end at 1. So I encourage you to raise your hand, put a question or comment in the chat, and we'll go through them after the presentation portion. So I am pleased to introduce our moderator for today, who will in turn introduce our dialoguers. Elizabeth Danze. Elizabeth is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, professor at the UT School of Architecture, and principal with the firm Danze Blood Architects. Danze's work integrates practice and thought across disciplines by examining the convergence of psychology with the tangibles of space and construction. At the School of Architecture, she has served as interim dean, associate dean for graduate programs, and associate dean for undergraduate programs. Danze is the recipient of the University of Texas System Regents Outstanding Teaching Award, is a member of the University of Texas Academy of Distinguished Teachers, and a distinguished professor of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. Welcome, Elizabeth. Thank you for being here to moderate today.
Well, it's so great to be here. I'm really happy to be moderating this session, and I'm not going to do actually a lot of talking or moderating. I'm going to really want to hear from Miriam and Nerea. So with that, I'm going to jump right in with introductions. And Leora, shall I introduce both of our speakers or at the same time? Okay, all right, I'll do both. So let me start with Miriam. She's an assistant professor of community and regional planning here at UT. Her research focuses on infrastructure planning and design, examining how infrastructure can reinforce racialized inequality. She highlights organizational, procedural, and policy strategies that advance social justice. Dr. Solis's ongoing research projects involve partnerships with nonprofit organizations and local government, including EcoRise, an Austin-based environmental education organization, and the Austin Department of Public Works. And this year through 2022, the UT Austin Humanities Institute Fellow, she's doing work there on youth perspectives, on racial justice, and decarbonization. So looking forward to hearing from Miriam. Then Nerea Feliz is an assistant professor, founder of Nerea Feliz Studio, and half of the design team, Double Happiness. I love that name. It's such a great name for a firm. Her research encompasses scholarly and creative activities with a sustained focus on public interiority. Situated at the intersection of architecture, interior design, and interior urbanism, her work explores interior design's role as a mediator between us, public spaces we occupy, and pressing cultural and political questions. Feliz holds a master's in architecture from the Polytechnic University of Madrid. She's a registered architect in Spain and in the UK, and prior to moving to the US, she worked with Foster Partners and Zaha Hadid Architects, among others. Her work has been published and exhibited nationally and internationally. I want to say one thing before I turn it over to our speakers. I think it's so interesting, both of these scholars, their work is, I would say, we might have thought before that their work was at the edges of their disciplines. And it's interesting to think that how the edges actually can occupy and might occupy, and in fact, maybe do occupy the center of the discipline. So that's one thing. And the other is how their work so naturally integrates other disciplines and other outside what we think of as being the normative or the more traditional way of thinking about their respective disciplines. So I love that. I'm going to be looking for those things, and I'm going to turn it over. So Miriam and Nerea, which one would like to go first? Maybe Miriam, if you're ready. Okay. All right, great. Miriam?
Sounds great. I will be using PowerPoint. Very fond of it. Let me share. Okay. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me organize. So I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Elizabeth and Leora. This is a very exciting conversation for me. I think it's very unique in its structure. I am a very traditional planner by training. Most of the reading that I engage is from planning journals. And so this is very exciting for me because I love the way you put it, Elizabeth, is that by being at the margins, we can also be at the center. And I want to learn from everyone about your perspectives on how to identify those intersections for potential future cross-pollination and collaborations. So I'm very excited. Today I'll be talking about the intersection of sports stadiums and society. And I want to point out that this connects to my work in a few different ways. Elizabeth touched on my work being focused on environmental justice. And it's really exciting for me to know actually that this idea of player recreation has been widely documented as being a central part of environmental justice. So when in recent years, when I've expressed this interest in sports and stadiums, I get a lot of questions. Well, how does that relate to the environment? But in formal adoptions of environmental justice, play and recreation forms a central part of that. So the connection has been documented, and I'm very curious about drawing that out further over the years to come. A second way in which this connects to my work is on this idea of infrastructure. So I am largely interested in urban infrastructure, water infrastructure in particular, and I would argue that stadiums and arenas are another form of infrastructure. Some people use definitions that adhere to notions of need. So we need water infrastructure, so that's infrastructure. We don't technically need sports stadiums and arenas, but culturally they're so important. As are other types of facilities that generally aren't considered infrastructure, like schools. So I approach stadiums and arenas with this environmental justice lens, and with the understanding that they're a type of infrastructure with a very large footprint in our urban environment. And my understanding of how to bring these different conceptual and theoretical frameworks together, I draw a lot on sports sociology. And this is a whole body of work that discusses the cultural and political contestation that takes place through sports. So every aspect of the game and where this game takes place or how this play takes place contains political and cultural meaning that is simultaneously contested. And so today I'll be going over 5 scales of some of that political contestation. I start at the site of the court or the field. I then look at the stadium or the arena, then the neighborhood, and then the city. I think I might have only said 4. But I'll be talking about 5, and I'll be using examples that have been documented elsewhere, both in the literature and in the media. So some of these examples y'all may be very familiar with. So I do want to start with a bit of background. As part of the Take a Knee movement initiated by Colin Kaepernick in defense for Black lives and against police violence, the role of sports as being a site for political contestation has gained new meaning, and more attention has been focused on it. But from a very practical and planning perspective, we also see a trend in how these facilities, the footprint that they take up in our cities and the level of investment that's now going into them. So the Hollywood Park Stadium cost a whopping $2.6 billion, and that's actually been on the lower end of total projected costs. Analysts put it more at $5 or $6 billion because it's typically not just the stadium or arena that's being constructed, but there's a whole additional layer of change happening around it. And so these facilities are often anchors for larger development initiatives happening in a given city. But if we are to zoom in to the site of the court and the field, we see how that contestation happens in at the smallest scale. When it comes to the history of integration and segregation in this country, the court and the field has been a manifestation of who's included and who's excluded. And the history of baseball is a very good example of that. So baseball is known as America's pastime. Critics have pointed out that this nostalgia associated to America's pastime usually is a very white idea of what the history of this country is, and doesn't take into account that the sport itself has been very exclusionary. And so this is why we've seen the emergence of teams that people of color create on their own and lead on their own. And the Negro Leagues are a good example of that. So even when people of color are allowed onto the court or the field, there are patterns about who gets to play what positions. And so who plays what role on a given team can be racialized. And there have been good analyses on the roles football players assume. An example of how their positions are racialized is that quarterbacks tend to be white. The quarterback position is typically or understood as a position that involves higher IQ. At least that's how it's covered in the media. It's associated to intelligence, whereas other positions like the wide receiver tend to be held by Black men. And again, a lot of racism is involved in covering these positions. The coverage on these positions often focuses on the physicality of the players themselves. So when we zoom out a little bit and look at the stadium and the arena, we also see a lot of contestation, and Indigenous mascots or team names are one area where communities have heavily contested this practice because they have argued that these symbols, these racist symbols, contain deeper psychological and social effects. And the use of the Washington Redskins name is an example of that. Unfortunately, Indigenous movements have had some success in getting teams to change their mascots or team names. And so that's why now, instead of being the Washington Redskins, we have the Washington football team. And this, for us, hits really close to home. When we look at what happens in the rest of the facility, in the bleachers, in the vendor areas, there's cultural and political contestation happening there as well. This idea of a fandom, who the fandom is, the message that that fandom projects, can also contain a lot of racist meaning. And here on the UT campus, The Eyes of Texas, which is a spirit song for the university, has been heavily criticized and prompted a huge protest because of its racist history. So another way in which stadiums and arenas have been criticized, or another reason I should say, is for the huge implications that they hold for the environment. When we use stadiums and arenas, not only do they have a big footprint, but there's a lot of consumption that takes place within them. A lot of food and resources, a lot of water. And so there's been a lot of discussion about how to make these facilities more sustainable. And a related part of the discussions is, what should we do with these facilities when they're abandoned? And a good example of abandonment is with Olympic arenas and stadiums. Oftentimes they're not used after a series of Olympic Games. But in the United States, we also often see that teams abandon their home stadium or arena. And so there's a growing discussion about how to turn them into something else, how to renovate them or redevelop them in ways where they have new uses. And this is an example of the Lakewood Church, led by Joel Osteen in Houston. And he spent, he and his church spent $95 million to renovate the former home of the Houston Rockets. Now, it's important to note that this, even though this is a celebrated example of a new use for a stadium, that's a huge price tag. And the new use, this new use has also been known to be very exclusionary. An example of that is when Hurricane Harvey happened, the church leadership did not allow people to use it as a place for shelter, despite its large size. At the neighborhood, we also see some very important political meaning associated to stadiums and arenas. And more specifically, the discussions about gentrification and displacement are very important. Now, there are two forms of displacement that have been discussed in the literature. One is direct displacement. So recently, the LA Dodgers won the World Series, and some of the media caught on to something very important, a very important tension for a lot of Latino spectators and fans, which is that even though the Latino community is known for being a very important fan base for the LA Dodgers, there are also many people in the community that understand its very dark history. When the LA Dodgers Stadium was built, many Latino families were displaced, were forcibly displaced. And these families had created a community there because they were prevented from living in other parts of the city. And this was a very violent removal that is well documented in LA history. And then there are slower forms of gentrification and displacement. And the Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta, home of the Atlanta Falcons, I think captures this contradiction this tension and a contradiction very well. And the contradiction that I'm referring to is that this stadium is known for being, in quotes, the most sustainable sports venue in the world. It's the first professional sports stadium to achieve LEED Platinum in the US, which is the highest LEED rating. So it's very, again, celebrated, and many other firms and planners look to the stadium for ideas on what they can do to create more sustainable and environmentally friendly facilities. The tension here, though, is that the development of this stadium is having a role in the gentrification of Atlanta's west side. We have a lot of community-based organizations now speaking up and organizing against this displacement. Now, at the level of the city, a lot of the conversation or the political nature of this conversation takes place with regard to how a given facility is financed. George Lipschitz, who's a planner and an architect, I believe a designer, has documented how in St. Louis, the financing of the stadium directly affected the revenue that was going into the school district. And this was a particularly important documentation of the inequitable impacts of stadium and arena development, because 85% of students in the public school district qualified for subsidized lunches. So this was a very poor group of students. And because the revenue for the St. Louis school system, and so the revenue from the St. Louis school system was diverted to finance the development of the St. Louis Rams Stadium. And then here in Austin, we have a very good example. We have, the city is, most of the city, I should say, is very excited to have a new soccer stadium. And this is a very important case because the city actually did a lot to secure what we call community benefits. So new public transit options are going to form part of this development. There's a lot of green space. Nonetheless, advocates have pointed out that prior to the development of this stadium, this was city-owned land that could have possibly had other uses, like housing, like the housing that so many of the city's residents need, because affordability has been heavily reduced in the city. And then at the scale of the country, and I think this image does a really good job of connecting how the national discussions being led by athletes themselves links to a larger political movement at the level of the country through acts that they take on the site of the court or the field. And I want to point out how this particular movement in recent years has manifested across sports, across genders, and initiated a whole series of conversations that are making sports and stadiums a more central part of how we think about social inequality and the built environment. So I will stop there. I believe I did pretty good on time. I will stop sharing.
Was perfect on time. So it's really, really interesting, Miriam's wonderful talk. That, you know, the very last slide, the very last image makes me think about those who complained about the athletes taking a kind of political position, let's say, and this idea that does not belong in sports, right? That they protesting watching sports because that kind of thing and sports itself do not align or don't exist. It seems like there's a really what you're saying is they cannot be separated, that they're always interlocked. There's always an interlocking, in fact, at every scale, from the scale of the player to the scale of the city and beyond in the country. So it's really, I thought it was really, really fascinating, all of it. Thank you for focusing on what you did, and particularly this idea of scale from the person to beyond. Nerea, would you like to jump in with your talk? And Miriam and Nerea both, one thing before, maybe before Nerea starts, is that I'd be really interested to know how each of you, what each of you thinks about the other's talk, like something about the talk that you feel either intersects with your own work or doesn't intersect, or even something that you might wonder about or question, since your interests are overlapping in some ways and actually divergent and very different in others. So I'm going to mute myself, and Nerea, I'll let you get started.
I don't know. Hold on, something is wrong. Let me share my screen again.
It looks okay on this end.
Yeah?
Yeah. At first we saw your like your view, but then it looked like just the slide. So
Hold on.
presenter view was showing it first, but then went away.
Let me see again. 1 second.
That looks right.
That's good. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's working.
Okay, great. Thank you. Oh, hold on. But I thought I wasn't sharing. Are you seeing me now or not?
Yeah. We see you and your screen.
Okay, and you see my notes or just the screen? Everything.
Just the screen.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for the intros, and thank you, Miriam, for the presentation. I really loved it. To me, it's surprising that in the end it's true that I wouldn't have expected originally when Leora suggested this meeting, but that there's a lot of overlap in our work. I mean, I decided to, in the end, just present this one project. I mean, is the research I've been doing on this building, the Sutrobats, that actually you're also familiar with, but that I think relates most to these ideas, to this part of the work of Miriam about social infrastructure, play or play facilities as some sort of form of social infrastructure, and then also the different scales of segregation or ability to share this play. So with that, I think I'm just gonna get started. So yeah, this is part of this research, ongoing research on the Sutrobats that is going to become an article is going to come out I think in the next month or so in the Architectural Histories Journal, the open access journal of the European Architectural History Network. I'm going to use the Sutrobats as a backdrop to look at the birth of a modern phenomenon of recreational swimming and its unfortunate history of social segregation or the segregation of play. So the Sutrobats, which were built in 1894, were an encapsulated microcosms and the ambitious dream of a self-made millionaire, engineer, and later mayor of San Francisco, Adolf Sutro. Sutro, a German immigrant and entrepreneur, managed to enclose a portion of the Pacific Ocean inside a spectacular glass palace in Point Lobos in San Francisco. And with this, Sutro inaugurated a new typology, an architectural formula to capitalize on the ludic pleasures of bathing, consumption, and leisure. A multi-level system of open platforms facing a gigantic body of water comprised of 7 pools against the ocean backdrop provided the perfect spatial organization for play, strolling, and delightful voyeurism. The seaside was sheltered, warmed, tamed, and commodified within 3 vaulted glass naves supported by a combination of iron columns and wooden trusses. Launched as the largest interior space for bathers in the world at the time, the Sutrobats were an early precursor of the contemporary water park and a strange mix of swimming pools, elevated promenades, club rooms, an amphitheater, a taxidermy collection, a wax museum, antique seashells, and a winter garden. The location of the Sutrobats was Point Lobos, a promontory on the city's west coast of San Francisco. And the facility had the capacity for over 1,600 bathers and up to 25,000 visitors. Stylistically, the structure was very eclectic, where a monumental classic staircase led visitors from the entry to the dressing rooms in a dazzling descent of nearly 100 feet, framed on both sides by platforms with tropical plant life. The dramatic access sequence evoked a palatial, palace-like experience for bathers from all economic backgrounds. It was a kind of Pyrenean space where suspended platforms, gardens, and hovering balconies at different levels overlooked the pools and the ocean view. Part of the experience of play at the Sutro baths was seeing and being seen, the conscious pleasure of simultaneously consuming and creating a novel metropolitan experience. The urban scale and character of the elevated streets, together with the vast proportions of the space, created an urban interior. The indeterminate quality of the space and the visual accessibility of multiple activities stimulated consumption and the spontaneous emergence of new uses. Multiple activities were offered simultaneously, inciting a feeling of free will in the users. The 19th century was marked by a devastating series of epidemic diseases. Tuberculosis in particular was the primary cause of death in Europe and the United States. The first public pools in the US were a product of the progressive era. Public officials built pools for less wealthy populations, mostly immigrant and working class citizens, in response to fear of the spread of diseases in crowded urban centers. Examining the swimming facilities from the end of the 19th century shows the level of innovation of Sutro's initiative to provide the city of San Francisco with a purely recreational swimming space encased in glass. On the East Coast, city officials were installing recreational river baths as cleansing and cooling points for the poor. Bathing was perceived as a tool to combat disease and maintain social disorder. These austere river bathing structures were intended to make river swimming safer during the warmer summer months. These types of facilities consisted of a modest one-story wooden box that sheltered the tanks and the bather bodies from the outside gazes. The fortress-like nature of this structure was literally visible in some of the projects that crowned the building with battlements, like we see on the right. Considering social practices around nudity and the standard bathing architectural types of the time, Sutro's choice of a transparent envelope glass building was very revolutionary at the time. But Sutro's typological innovation was not only the use of glass, but that in relationship with the classical origin of the bathing typology, especially if we trace it back to the Roman term, traditionally the natatorium was secondary to cleaning. So essentially, most bathing facilities up until this point, they were basically serving the purpose of cleansing and not recreational swimming. So with Sutro's baths, the natatorium finally emancipated itself from the rest of the bathing facility to become the main feature of the space. So the Sutro baths mark a turning point where bathing was no longer concealed under these walls. The body was celebrated and it was exposed and commodified as a recreational activity and a visual spectacle to be shared by the men and women of San Francisco. So Sutro's leisure complex was also conceived as a welcoming structure, simultaneously catering for the elites and the working class of San Francisco. In his own words, Sutro intended the baths as a breathing spot for the poor people as a benefit to the public. The Sutro baths were part of a bigger complex of play facilities called the Sutro Pleasure Grounds, all belonging to Adolf Sutro. This I discovered in preparing this presentation more extensively, and I was quite fascinated. He had really fought to make accessibility affordable to the grounds, to these Sutro Pleasure Grounds, to the point that he built his own train line. And in this, around the facility, there were also these haunted swing, mystic maze, wheel and wooden roller coaster that were all around the Sutro baths. And I was particularly shocked yesterday when looking at these haunted swings that basically they fool the visitors into thinking that they were turning 360 degrees when it was actually the room that was all glued and designed to turn 360 degrees. So the people were actually constantly in the same position. I mean, they were swinging back and forth, but not actually flipping. The Sutro baths hosted a very unique combination of athletic competition, spontaneous play, acrobatic displays, and curiosities such as Professor Carl, the marvelous anthropic amphibian who eats, drinks, smokes, rides, and sleeps underwater, the highest diving dog act in the world, or the donut race, where the contestants had to eat 6 donuts before swimming. Classic music concerts were also held at the space. And finally, Sutro also included a museum inside the baths, quote, to help install in the minds of youthful visitors a desire for learning. So the museum displayed all sorts of curiosities, trophies from Sutro's own journeys, careful collections of shells, stuffed animals, medieval arbors, and wax statues, and even an Egyptian mummy. And altogether, what's interesting is that the mishmash of mundane activities with cultural programs and elevated aspirations attracted a very diverse socioeconomic crowd to the baths, which was, again, something relatively new at the time. Play, like Miriam was also talking in these terms about, contributes to the strengthening of a community as an agent of social integration. But play also is a double-edged social sword because it contributes to a feeling of inclusiveness along with the participants, but at the same time, indirectly contributes to the exclusion of the others, those who are not part of the game. And the first pools from the progressive area were heavily segregated by socioeconomic class and by gender. Reformers initially established clear gender and class divisions, but not so much racial ones. Men and boys accounted for up to 90% of all the swimmers in municipal pools at the time, including at the Sutro baths, like in this image that is all men, basically. Toward the end of the 19th century, Americans across the socioeconomic spectrum bathed, but not together. In his book, Contested Waters, A Social History of Swimming Pools in America, Jeff Wiltz explains how gender segregation was common in most spheres of social life at the time, including bathing. Women were allowed to access public pools only during men's working hours or on selected days of the week. Gender segregation ensured that men and women didn't share waters. Unfortunately, but not coincidentally, as gender divisions slowly disappeared, racial segregation grew stronger. Wills maintains that it was precisely gender integration what led to racial segregation, or the intensification of racial segregation. So throughout the 19th century, swimming was fairly unpopular among women, and the fact that their swimming suits could weigh up to 15 pounds didn't really help. Here you see one of those river baths in New York when it's attended only by women, and the Sutro were not an exception, but they were at the same time. So there was a special tank dedicated for women. And of course, they also provided separate dressing rooms. So even though the Sutro baths originally didn't allow men and women to bathe in the same pools, the openness of the design fostered everyone to witness both male and female swimming activities. Unlike most other baths at the time, at Sutros, men and women could casually socialize right before and after bathing. So the fact that visually there was no barriers, the unobstructed gaze, and the absence of partitions dividing the swimming space by gender was a significant small step towards gender integration. Unfortunately, soon after the establishment opened to the public, it also became the setting for one of the first cases of segregation-related litigation in the United States. Shortly after opening the baths in 1897, the Civil Rights Devil Bill law passed in California making it illegal to prohibit African Americans from entering any pool establishment. Shortly after the new law was passed, John Harris, a Black citizen, requested access to the Sutro baths and it was denied. Mr. Harris sued the establishment. The press reported this statement by Sutro's son, saying that the African Americans were allowed to enter the baths as spectators, but not permitted to go in the water. Quote, "It is not a matter of personal feeling with us, but of business necessity. It would ruin our baths here because the white people would refuse to use them." Jeff Wills describes how the following decades, pools would continue to be sites of marked racial discrimination. Recreational segregation in swimming pools, amusement parks, and even beaches would continue well into the 20th century. After the 1964 Rights Act, a large part of the white population ceased going to public pools, and residential suburbs were filled with private pools and clubs where racial discrimination was considered acceptable. Many city halls stopped investing in public pools as recreational infrastructures and allowed the country's public pools to progressively deteriorate. Sutro interior microcosms encapsulated 19th century racial and gender discrimination practices together with the cultural aspirations of the time. The grand structure monumentalized the emerging values of sanitation, health, and exercise, providing a safe and respectable space for play for the working class. And so like this, Sutro inaugurated a new typology, an architectural formula to capitalize on the ludic pleasures of bathing, consumption, and leisure. Throughout the 20th century, with the demographic explosion of working middle class, the demand for spaces for leisure and consumption grew. Just to end, I would say that the construction of worlds in the classic is a classic type of play, that miniature models like Legolands, doll houses enable the fabrication of safe alternative realities by children. I see the Sutro baths also as a microcosms, as Sutro's own creation of an alternative world of play with warm ocean water, taxidermied animals, seashells, and selected tropical plants, where nature was benign and the ocean views were available from a controlled climatic environment, which was something very novel at the time. The neutralization and commodification of nature into a harmless, consumable leisure experience inside a transparent envelope situated the building both within nature and apart from it. The structure was one in a series of attempts to construct autonomous atmospheres for immersion within altered states, encapsulated portions of the world, manufactured interiors, offering a new type of socio-natural form. Today, after a fire burned the structure in 1966, the old concrete pools are contemporary ruins. Okay, I'm done, I think, with that. I don't know how I did with time.
Perfect. You did perfect with time. Absolutely. That was beautiful. That was wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you for that, Nerea. So I'm going to ask Miriam if she wants to comment at all on Nerea's talk, and then Nerea, if there's something. I probably others did too. Saw definitely much overlap between the two, the areas that both of you are looking at, and actually also quite different. So, but Miriam or Nerea, if you want to maybe comment on the other person's work and talk, which I found absolutely fascinating in both talks, absolutely incredibly interesting. I don't see a question in the chat, although Leora, you might have one on YouTube, but if there aren't questions, I'd love to hear what Miriam and Nerea think about each other's presentation.
I'll briefly say three things, or comment on three things. I think it's I think it's really great that I mostly drew on contemporary examples, and you took us to a different century. That's certainly reflected in the visuals, but also it makes me wonder, what was going on at the time in San Francisco that led to this development of such a huge project. I think that it's really interesting for us to see this presentation because in Round Rock, actually just a few days ago, the largest indoor water park in the world just opened. It's part of a resort. So we have an example very close to home of a potential more recent iteration of kind of project that you're talking about. So I'm digressing at this point, but I'm curious about what was happening at the time, because it started off as a seemingly progressive initiative, particularly with regard to its inclusion of people across class lines. And then this idea of the rolling back of those progressive ideals. That's also something that we see happen across history. And finally, the role of gender and race and class and the intersections among them as also being a very central theme. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Miriam. I think, what was happening in, I think that definitely overall one could say that Sutro's project was progressive at the time at many levels. It was also part of the times, the racial discrimination that was taking place. Not justifying it in any way, it's just saying that it was part of the times. And even a kind of forward-thinking project like this, of course, had those same societal issues. But it was interesting, I think, the kind of grandeur of the proposal, which was indeed compared to other ones, to other projects that were being built at the time, a lot more modest, no? It's a combination of factors. I think Sutro was a little, not Trumpian, but maybe yes. I mean, this big figure, bigger than himself. He became mayor of San Francisco, and he was very pro private initiatives. I think I'm not so familiar with the history of the United States, but I imagine that the East Coast versus the West Coast, that from what I've read, San Francisco was not yet so developed, made it different also in terms of having maybe, it was a significantly smaller city, so I don't know that they could have that kind of public engagement. But then also it's interesting, this project in the context of California, who was becoming a little bit, the state of California was beginning to become a kind of a sanatorium of the world, where people were migrating because of the good weathers, but it was mostly related to the south of California, to Los Angeles, etc., where there was starting all this new culture about health, sport, etc., that I think Sutro might have been somehow aware of, because again, this idea of swimming as a sport and as a recreational activity was not yet that common or mainstream, in that even it really wasn't like swimming became an Olympic sport 2 years afterwards, after the opening of the pools. So it wasn't really at the time yet. So yeah, I think it was innovative in many ways. But I thought from your talk, it's of course very interesting to see how some of these issues persist, and across time, even if in a lot more subtle ways. And with that, and I don't know so much about this, I was very curious about this idea of the stadiums as an anchor for development, but that in a city, but that where of course I presume is a very specific kind of development also that goes around them, and I think you've talked a little bit about that, but maybe if you can elaborate a little bit more on the kind of pros and cons, and then also on the nature of those investments, how in the US, how how much of that is like a public investment or and private investment, or how do cities deal with this? If you know, and I'm sure there are very different cases throughout, so I may not have like a one answer.
Yeah, there's been quite a research done on the different financing mechanisms for stadiums and arenas. And however, they're mostly privately owned, where the public is directly affected by that is where local jurisdictions make decisions about how to decrease the level or how those private teams and owners are going to be taxed. And so we have a couple of examples of stadiums and arenas that are publicly owned, but they're mostly privately owned. Sometimes we see instances of the stadium, the actual facility being privately owned, but the land being leased. So the land itself stays in public hands. And so that's where the taxation conversations get very complicated, because that's when a city can create a certain level of expectation about how to tax the private entity. So these are conversations about governance, and professional sports teams have very, very sophisticated governance structures and ownership structures. And so they wield a lot of power when it comes to the negotiations that they engage in cities with.
Thank you both for that. There's a question from Michelle, and Michelle Eddington. I don't know if she wants to read it. Looks like there you are, Michelle. Yeah. Do you want to ask your hard question?
Yeah, maybe, and I'm going to have to bail in about 3 minutes, so I might not hear the answer to this. But if we go back to what a lot of the let's just say the evolution of the baths in the late 19th century, and how much of that related to a chronic disease, which was tuberculosis or consumption. What was so different about the American experience in dealing with that disease was taking the Alpine cure, which was popular in Europe, and which involved, the sanitaria and the baths, and then turning it into an outdoor cure to the point that the outdoor cure included a lot of actually tourism. So that took place on it. But the more this got developed, the more it was the provenance of only the wealthy. So only the wealthy could enjoy that. And of course, the entire specter of tuberculosis at the time was that it was not just sort of a disease that actually all people of all societal levels were a victim of, but it was still very much associated with immigrants, and a great deal of discrimination about immigrants and their filth. It was how much of it was described at the time. And now I think about how the tables have flipped, and that we're singling out sports events as being epicenters. And so in some ways we're still pointing at the other. We're still, even insofar as the whole spectacle of sports now is actually meant to be for the entertainment primarily of the wealthy, the fact that we're kind of identifying them and having them as epicenters is that we're continuing to sort of blame, the athletes. We're putting our focus on these people are actually sort of causing this, and I'm fascinated by how this different narratives continue to repeat the same story on this, and how it's being played out through our play. So it was more of an observation, but I'm also, whether there's other ways at looking at how these threads of health allow us to cling to certain kinds of modes of discrimination. And that for some reason, it seems even more present as I listen to your talks, which were great, by the way. And I've got like 30 seconds before I got to switch to this other meeting. So.
Well, one of the things that it reminds me of is that I was actually just reading a study on the inequitable distribution of parks. So this hits very close to home. So lower income communities of color tend to have fewer parks, more affluent communities tend to have more parks. But it's not just the park site itself, but the actual infrastructure around the park sites tends to also be worse in low income communities of color, thereby reducing the use of the parks because people don't have a good, and children in particular don't have a good and safe way of accessing the park. And so I think that that's why this notion of scale is so interesting, is that it tells us, I like how you put it, Michelle, in terms of this very much being an exercise of spectatorship, but it also allows us to see across scales to better understand local context and how these different variables all connect in very important ways to understand local material inequalities.
Okay, I'm going to have to thank you so much. This was a fabulous ending, and thank you, Leora, for all the work that you've done this semester in organizing these great conversations. It's been fabulous. I've so enjoyed it.
Thank you. We've enjoyed having you at all of them. It's been such a pleasure.
Elizabeth, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, Leora. Yes, while we're talking about this, I think I also want to thank Leora. I know it's 1 o'clock. It's almost 1, and I know students have to go off to class. But I love that Leora thought about this session, and that she had the foresight to think that this would that there was this convergence that could occur in these seemingly very disparate areas of scholarship and research. So. Thank you for that, Leora.
Yeah, thank you. And if you, for those of you who are here, if you enjoyed this format, most of our forums for next semester are this dialogue format. So I hope you'll join again.
I think it's wonderful. Thank you, Nerea. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Leora.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you all for joining.
Okay. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Okay.